We have a wonderful schedule this spring. I hope you will join us for all of the other meetings. Without further ado, today, let me introduce our moderator, Katharina Werner, who joins us as a postdoctoral research fellow from the University of Munich. She's been here with us this year, and we're grateful for that. Katharina?
Thank you, Antonio. Also from my side, welcome everybody to this talk. We had to reshuffle our program just a tiny little bit. So not to worry though, the talk that was originally scheduled for today, it's still happening. It's going ahead on the 3rd of May. So do make sure to be on the newsletter and make sure to come back if you are looking forward to that one. We are very excited today that we have an excellent talk that we could line up. And so we have Paul Peterson, who is the director of the program on education policy and governance, and also the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard. And he's agreed to talk to us today about who benefits from local financing of education. So I just want to remind everybody while the talk is happening, if you have any questions that come up, you can either raise your hand, and if it's appropriate, I might call on you. This is a meeting, so you will be able to use your microphone and camera if you wish. You can also always feel free to type your questions in the chat, and then we can have a discussion after the talk as well to kind of discuss any points further that come up in the talk. So with all that said, I'm looking forward to your presentation. Paul, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Katharina. This presentation is giving you some results that we're pretty sure of, and then some preliminary results that we also think are correct, but we're still doing some final analyses. So we decided to go forward with it, given the development that we had an opening where we could present this. Carlos Lastra and I have worked on this for quite some time, and he's unable to be here because he's got classes at exactly this moment over there in Madrid. But he was deeply involved in the analysis at all stages. So the topic that's of interest to us is, should government services be funded locally or not? And we're going to look at that question specifically in education. Should education be funded by local government or by state and federal grants? And that's a topic that is very much on the political agenda. We've seen over the course of the 20th century a major shift in financing from the local government to the state government, so that today only 44% is funded locally, 56% is being funded by the state or federal government. Now that was in 2007. I don't think it's changed too much since that time, but since our data is going to come primarily from 2007, though not exclusively, that's the number I'm giving you here. But you should realize that the United States is much more a decentralized, locally funded educational system than in most countries. In the OECD, 78% of the funding comes from higher tiers of government. But the United States may be moving in that direction because the courts in many states are requiring equal funding across school districts within a state. And that usually means that there will be a reduction in the local share of funding. And we're going to see some instances of that in the course of the presentation. So given the fact that this is a legal issue, a policy question, a debate that goes on as to whether or not the local government is the best source or the national government, we are offering the first information that we have on this from a national probability sample. So the debate in the literature, the theoretical literature, can be summarized by saying, this is an oversimplification, of course, but you can simplify it by saying it's a debate between two economists, Thibault and Oates. Thibault made the claim that locally funded service delivery is efficient because the residents choose the tax spending packages that each local government provides by moving to the places that provide the services they want and don't provide the others. And if they provide them efficiently, they go to the efficient places rather than the others. And because of the competition among these local governments, you're going to have an efficient distribution of local services. Now, Oates replies that, well, actually, local services will be underfunded when the benefits spill over jurisdictional boundaries. That is to say, if you have a well-educated student population in your district, the people in the district will benefit, but so will people elsewhere. And if your students are not well educated, this will adversely affect people living in the community, but it will also affect people elsewhere because undereducated people impose costs on the rest of the society. And this is especially true in the area of redistribution. If there are benefits to society from the redistribution of wealth, then you can't expect local governments to do it because the more they provide services for the poor, the more poor people they get. And they are reluctant to have poor people who don't pay taxes. So you will have an under provision of services to meet the needs of the needy if you rely strictly on local governments for providing that service. So there's quite a large literature on it. I'm not going to go through the literature. These are some citations to the literature. There's a lot more. But the bottom line of the literature review is that there is no study out there that has estimated the efficiency and the distributional effects of funding services from local resources as distinct from intergovernmental grants for a nationally representative sample. As far as we can find in the literature, we don't have anybody who says, well, do you get higher quality services if you leave it to the local government primarily? Or do you get, it doesn't make any difference? And then secondly, do you underfund services to less advantaged segments of the population if you fund it locally as distinct from intergovernment grants, or doesn't it make any difference? Nobody's really tried to look at that for a nationally representative sample. So that's what we're bringing to the table here today. So, to take the mystery out of the story right from the beginning, bad thing to do, but here it is. We do find that local government provides higher quality services in education if they fund it more from local resources. Students get higher test scores if they go to school in districts that are locally funded. And we also find that the SES achievement gap, the difference between those from families who are better off, the haves, let's say, the have-nots do not do as well when the funding comes from local level. So let's see how we get there. There's a lot of struggle to get to that conclusion. So let us see how we come to those particular findings. So we're going to use three approaches. We're going to estimate the effects on student achievement in math and reading, the effect of funding from local levels on student achievement in math and reading with three methods. One is the simple ordinary least squares model, where you just run a regression and you control for a lot of variables and then you see what you get. And that's sometimes called a descriptive model because it's very hard to claim you've got a causal estimate there. Then we're going to take advantage of the school finance reforms that courts have ordered and states have undertaken in recent years to see what happens when they tell states you have to fund school districts more equally than you have in the past. And in the process, state funding goes up and the share of funding by local governments declines. So, and then finally, if we have the time, we'll talk about our geographical regression discontinuity analysis, which compares 2 states or more than 2 states. We compare states who have high funding and states who have low funding. And we look at what happens at the border, at the school districts, at the students who are right at the border. But we may not get to that today, we'll see. So our data come from, and feel free to interrupt me if any of this is confusing, because I want to clarify anything as we go along here and not leave it all to the end. And so just raise your hand, as Katharina said. Our data come from the National Assessment of Educational Progress that is used to ascertain student performance for the No Child Left Behind, and it was introduced beginning in 1990, has been expanded since then. Its latest administration, I think, was in 2019. We're going to use data up until 2017 for the school finance analysis, but primarily we're going to rely for our ordinary least squares analysis on the 2007 sample, which we decided upon some years ago because it was prior to the recession that took place that might have temporarily disturbed the general pattern. So we have individual level test scores in math and reading for over 200,000 observations. So we have a lot of information that we can use for our event study analysis. And we have a smaller subset, but still a very sizable number of observations for the year 2007. Now, we're going to have in that data set indicators of the socioeconomic status of the family from which the student comes. Students report to, at the time they take the test, they report what their parents' education was. And we have from administrative records the eligibility of the student for free and reduced lunch, which we take as a measure of income. And we also have some other individual characteristics that we're going to control for: ethnicity, gender, special education, eligibility, and so forth. Then we also have some district characteristics. We know what the percentage is in the district that's urban. We know the percent that's college educated. We know the average household income in the district. And then finally, we know how much is being spent per pupil. And we know the share of those expenditures, the revenue sources, whether the revenue sources are local or from a higher level of government. So that's the data that we're going to be working with in this analysis. It's a big, complicated data set, but it allows us to do quite a few things. So our OLS models, I was once told by a very wise old man who had a very successful career as an economist that you shouldn't believe any result unless you see 3 things. It should show up just when you look at it in the real world, because then common sense tells you this is probably so. But don't believe that unless you do a regression analysis and control for a lot of things and get the same thing. So that's what we do with the number 2. The number 1 is just a simple look at the world. The number 2 is we control for a lot of things, the kinds of things I just described in the data set. And then the third thing you should do is to do a causal model, which really tries to zero in, which is what our school finance model is. So that's why we're using these 3 different approaches, because I don't know if everybody believes this, but I thought that this is basically right. Don't believe anything unless you get this thing in 3 different ways. So, and we're also going to look for these equity effects by looking at whether or not effects are different for students from high or low income families based on their eligibility for free and reduced lunch. And we're going to look again separately for whether or not the parents were well educated. And model 4 up here on the screen is the one that we prefer because we think we have a better measure of education than of income. Free and reduced lunch is a sort of a noisy measure of income. So there's certain models here that we are giving a high priority to, and that's number 2 and number 4 of the OLS models. So here's the results. We find that local revenue share, the higher, every 10 percentage point increase in local revenue share increases student performance, or there's a correlation between student performance of about 1/10 of a standard deviation, 0.09. That's the simple little look at the world. Not controlling for anything. That's in model 1 up there. But that's probably not to be believed because, you know, people with money go to districts where the districts are asked to pretty much pay for things. So that's probably not giving you the right answer. And so the model 2, which we think is a pretty good model, that controls for all those variables that I just described. That controls for all those individual characteristics: parental education, eligibility for free and reduced lunch, ethnicity, gender, special education status, English language learner status, and a variety of other characteristics. So we try to control for a lot of those, and we control for district characteristics. We control for whether or not the district has a lot of people in it who are college educated, or a lot of people in the district have a higher income, and we also look at the percent urban. So we control for district characteristics, and then we control for state fixed effects. So we are only looking at variation within states here. So that's, we think, is controlling for a lot of things that affect student performance, and yet we see the percent local share still has a 5% of a standard deviation effect. Now, how big is 5% of a standard deviation? Well, it's hard to say, but about 25% of a standard deviation is probably about 1 year's worth of learning when you're talking about 8th graders, as we are in this particular study. So 5% is, you know, about 1/5 of that. So, you know, it's a couple of months worth of learning, you can think of it. So it's not massive. This is for every 10% increase in local revenue share, you get this much of an increase. But it's non-trivial. It's not like you can simply ignore it. Now, if you look at the equity effects can be estimated by interacting the term income and local revenue share after controlling for all of these other characteristics and controlling for the main effects of education, the main effects of income, and everything else. And you're also controlling here for per pupil expenditure. So it's not the amount of money we're talking about, it's local revenue share, because we're always, in all of these analyses, except the first model, we're controlling for per pupil expenditures. So low income effects are about, so the difference between those who are eligible for free and reduced lunch and those who are not is about 2% of a standard deviation. And when you look at education, it's about 3% of a standard deviation difference. So in other words, the negative impact on the disadvantaged is, we think, about 3% of a standard deviation. So that's, you know, not massive, but it is certainly statistically significant, and it's certainly worth thinking about. So that's our OLS model. That's our basic model. This applies to the districts throughout the United States because we were able to draw a national probability sample that would allow us to come up with these estimates. But there's a possibility that this is a biased estimate, because it could be that the people who really care about education for their children move to places where education is better, even after controlling for all of these characteristics. And it may be that government money goes to places where educational performance is low in order to improve things there. So OLS estimates can never be sort of accepted on their own unless you see whether or not they can be supported by other kinds of analyses. So this analysis, I think, is correct, but we're calling it a preliminary analysis because we're still doing some double checking on it. And the method that we're using is adapted from the work of Lafortune, Rothstein, and Schanzenbach. And that's a mouthful. So I'm going to call this the LRS approach. And we're very dependent upon LRS for our results, for our model here, because we do pretty much the same thing that they do, but they were interested in what are the effects of expenditures. If you spend more money, will you get higher performance? And they find that, yes, indeed, if you spend more money, as a result of these school finance reforms, if you spend more money on poor people, they will do better. But our question is different. Our question is, when these school finance reforms take place, they're going to shift the share that is paid for by local governments. Local governments are probably going to be paying less of the cost, and more of the cost is going to be picked up by the state government. So we're going to see a shift in local revenue share, and we're asking the question, well, what will be the impact of that? So to investigate that question, we wanted to have states where we could see what the pattern was before the event, before the school finance reform was ordered by the court, and compare it to the trend after the event, after the court had made that decision and the legislature had changed the funding levels. So we imposed a rule that said we've got to have at least 3 observations of performance by students from the NAEP. We're using the same NAEP data that I described before. We have to have 3 observations from the NAEP between 1990 and 2017 that took place before the school finance reform, and 3 observations afterwards. And we found, so we went to LRS's data set, and they have a very helpful appendix. They have a very detailed, informative appendix that provides you with a lot of accurate information. Well, I hope it's accurate. We're just assuming it's accurate because they did a very careful study here. So they tell us that the reforms did take place in these states that are on the screen here at the time when the dates are listed after each state. So for these 11 states, we say that's when the event occurs in these states. And we're going to look in these states to see what was student achievement like before and what was student achievement afterwards. And we got the student achievement data from the work that Danny Shaquille and I had done for another study, and supplemented it with some data from LRS, which they shared with us. So we're very grateful to both Danny Shaquille and LRS for sharing that information. And in all cases, we're controlling for expenditure because LRS shows that expenditure makes a difference. So we want to control for LRS. We want to control for expenditure that we get from knowing the results of the LRS study, and we want to control for all the other variables that we've controlled for in the previous analysis. So we have a lot of controls that we have included in here. So the question is, what does happen once you have the school finance reform event? So you probably already understand this, but here is specifically what we did, and the questions we asked was, how much does student achievement shift when you get a shift in funding? And then we say, well, that's then taking that information and making it comparable to our earlier analysis. How much would occur if the funding shift were 10 percentage points? Now, in some places it was 10 percentage points, in other places it was much less than that. But what if it were 10 percentage points everywhere? How much of an impact would this policy change have been on student achievement levels and also on equity, the impact on students from high SES backgrounds as compared to students from low SES backgrounds. So that's the question that we have here. And I guess one point that I need to also make is we then control for year effects. So by controlling for year effects across the country, we introduced something that LRS says is that's what they do. We're doing exactly what they did. We're getting something comparable to a diff analysis. If one assumes that the control states, the states that didn't have a school finance reform, if we assume this control state trend is the same as the trend nationwide. So if you can assume that what's happening in those control states is business as usual, then you have, what is the difference between states that experience this school finance reform from business as usual, trends nationwide? And then, of course, you have to assume that nothing else happened simultaneously in the states that did have the school finance reform. Did they undertake something else at exactly the same time? If so, then there's some questions about this approach. It's not a foolproof approach, of course, but the assumption is that for all 11 states to have some other event that's happening exactly at the same time as school finance reform is a bit of a stretch. So this is not too severe an assumption, but you may question it if you wish. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to show you the results. And this is part of the preliminary nature of the result is the axes are not very clearly defined. So I'm going to define them here. So the x-axis is going to be local funding share relative to the level that was in the year the school finance event occurs. And then we have the years before and the years after. So I'll come back to this slide probably just to explain this. So here's the picture. 0 is what happens at the time of the event. That's the school funding level at the time of the event. And then on the x-axis, you have 5 percentage points and 10 percentage points above or below. We only go down 5 percentage points below for the previous 6 years, and then for the 6 years following. So all you see here is that it actually shows that there is some school finance reform in the sense that you get some shift in who's paying the bill. Now, it's not as massive as you might think from the rhetoric about school finance reform. It's not like the world changes overnight. You're getting about a 2 to 3 percentage point change in the share of funding by local governments, which is non-trivial. I mean, you think about it, it's 44% nationwide in 2007. So a 2 percentage point change would bring it down to 42%, which is, a 5% reduction. And you can see there was some reduction that took place 6 and 5 years before, but the 4 years immediately before the school finance reform, things were more or less level in these 11 states. And then afterwards, it's always lower than it was before. So this is not telling us anything other than that we've got some leverage here. We've got something, this is a statistically significant change. So that gives us some analytical leverage to see what effect does this modest reduction in the share of funding from localities, what kind of an effect does it have on student achievement? So in the next slide, we show student achievement before and after. And on the x-axis, we're going to have the achievement level, and on the y-axis, we have years, just as previously. And this is going to be in standard deviations. So you should read this. It's 1% of a standard deviation here. You really, I would just, in our final analysis, we're going to say 0.01, 0.01, 0.02. So think of this as 1% of a standard deviation. So you can see that prior to the reform, student achievement, it's sort of noisy, but student achievement was a little higher than it was at the time of the event. The event is 0 on the screen. You've got 5 years previous, 5 years after, and 10 years out on the y-axis there. And you can see that student achievement was about flat in the prior period, flat but noisy. So 5 years out, you've got a very low estimate, and 4 years out, you have a high estimate. 3, 2, 1, the variation isn't that much because you're only talking about 1% of a standard deviation here. So this is capturing every little change. But then after the event, you see all the points are much lower, and the trend line is going down, and it goes down. And the further out you are, the bigger the effect is, which is what you would expect if funding levels don't have an immediate effect, or funding sources don't have an immediate effect, but have an effect gradually over a course of time. So this is the results that we have from the event study analysis, which we then check to see, well, how does this compare to the original analysis? And if you look at the event itself, the effects are not large. The effect on average performance is only 1% of a standard deviation. That's sort of shown there in the graphs. The difference between high and low SES students is quite substantial, 2% of a standard deviation. But it's all concentrated on the high SES students. The high SES students suffer a negative effect, and the low SES students, there's no effect. So that's just from the event itself, doesn't have big. Now, if you say, okay, then what would it be if the average district had 10% of a standard deviation change? Remember, the amount of change was only 2%, but what if we were 10%? Well, here we see the estimate for a 10% change, and the effects on the average performance is to reduce student learning by 5% of the standard deviation, which is exactly what we got in the original analysis. Original analysis showed that 10% a higher level of local funding produced 5% higher level student achievement. Here we find a reduction of 10% has a 5% negative impact. So it's just exactly the same effect size. And the difference between this analysis and the original analysis is that we find much larger equity effects. In the OLS analysis, we found that the equity effects were 3% of a standard deviation. Here we find it's 10% of a standard deviation. So which is 3 times as large. And so that's one of the ways in which this analysis yields results that are somewhat different from those that you get from the ordinary least squares analysis. Now, but the other side of the coin is that all the effects are concentrated on the high SES students, and they're negative. And you're not seeing any benefits for the low SES students. So there's a lot to talk about, right? One possibility is maybe there were some other reforms that had adverse effect on high SES students at the same time. Then that led to an exaggeration of these effects, or maybe that this is the better estimate of the equity effects than the those from the OLS model. Okay, so I'll make one more point and then we can open it up for discussion. We also look at what could be causing all this. And we take this idea from Hirschman, voice, exit, and loyalty. And he says there's 2 ways in which the public influences what governments do. And one is through politics. And the other way is by threatening to move to another community. So he says there's 2 ways in which at the local level, at least, you can influence your government. One is by putting political pressure on the school board. And the other is by leaving and going to some other place, and they have to worry about that. So we look to see whether there's any evidence that one or another channel is the channel by which we get these results. And we find actually that the higher the share that's paid for out of local resources, the smaller the class size in the district. And the more the money is concentrated on teachers and instruction, rather than other services like transportation, administration, and ancillary activities. So we find a significantly larger share of the money concentrated on instruction, which we know that parents want. There's plenty of data out there that show that parents like that. And parents like smaller class sizes. So we think that that's an indication that the voice channel is part of the explanation, that a local school board, if the money's coming from local resources, are more responsive to the community. And both these things are correlated with higher achievement. Smaller class size, increased concentration of money on instruction, are in our analysis, are both correlated with higher achievement. So we say the voice channel is probably part of the thing. But we also find what we call Huxley effects. Huxley wrote a famous article, extremely controversial, in which he said, the more exit opportunities within a metropolitan area, the more kids are going to learn, because the school board is going to worry about them leaving. Well, we use commuting zone rather than metropolitan area because we think commuting zones are a better measure of the opportunities to go elsewhere and still keep your job. But we do the same thing she does. We look at the number of school districts within a commuting zone. And we find that you don't find any results that of the kind that she gets unless you have money coming predominantly from the local community. If the commuting zone is dependent mainly on grants from the state and federal government and not so much from the local community, then you don't find these Huxley effects. But if you do have a lot of exit opportunities within the community zone, then we do find that it does lead to higher achievement. And the Huxby analysis we find the same thing that she identifies in her earlier study. So those are the channels. We think both the voice channel and the exit channel are operative, which is the more important. We don't have data that allows us to sort that out. So to summarize, we still like our national probability sample and our OLS model the best. We think that the event study analysis is interesting, but it is for only 11 states. And so, what we actually think the event study analysis does for us is it tells us that OLS model is probably not biased. It's probably giving us an unbiased estimate that we actually are capturing all the factors in our once we control for all these characteristics. So our interpretation of our results is that you get efficiency from local funding, but you get inequities as well, and that these are non-trivial. If you shifted 30% percentage points, then you could get a half year's worth of learning difference, depending on whether it's high or low. And then equity effects would be about a third of a year's worth of learning. So not massive, but certainly important. But I look forward to any comments, observations any of you may have.
Thank you, Paul, so much. This really is food for thought, a lot of to talk about. I can encourage everybody to kind of ask your questions in the Q&A if you prefer, or to raise your hand if you would like to be called on. I might use my chairing privilege to ask the first question, if you don't mind. So I thought it was really interesting to see on your OLS results, it looks like the interaction effects are negative if you interact your local share with the education and the income measures that you have for the individual students. So I'm talking about columns 3 and 4 here. But just kind of from looking at it, it seems as if the kind of combined effect might still be positive. So in the sense that if we add the effect for the local revenue share to the interaction effect, we would seem, my impression would be that we would still get positive effects for those who are classified as having a low income and having a lower education, so kind of like smaller but still positive. So I was just wondering if that is correct, if that's what you find in your analysis, and also kind of how you think about that, whether that is something, so other effects kind of positive and but smaller, or is it more because what you find in your event study is kind of that there's no effects?
Well, yes, in this analysis, we find that all boats rise, but luxury liners rise more than canoes, which is, I think, what you just said. Everybody benefits from local funding, but the benefits are greater for those from more advantaged families. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with your interpretation, in other words. But it's a little bit different for the event study analysis, because the event study analysis shows some negative effects. Total effects will be negative, I think. Yeah, I think. Because the average performance is increasing by 5%, but the negative effect on high is 10% of standard deviation. So that swamps the average. Yeah.
So comparing, if I can just follow up quickly, comparing the OLS and the event study, I guess, so the overall picture sheet seems to be similar, that kind of we are in a world where we have falling local shares. So is that something that would be the same for the event study and the OLS settings, that in the OLS settings also over the period, or in the data you have, that share would be falling? Is that correct? So should we think of this as something about low kind of low SES students seem to be harmed less by reductions in the local share, or do you think, or is there a reason to believe that there's an asymmetry between kind of rising and falling shares, that we would not expect to have linear effects across going through zero?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say the really robust finding here is that mean performance or average performance is affected by local revenue share. I mean, that's robust to both of these analyses, also robust to the geographic discontinuity analysis. We're getting pretty much the same results from that analysis. So that really persists across different approaches to the data. And the equity effects, it's a little less, I think we have to be a little less confident in our results because we're not getting exactly the same thing, whatever, you know, when we, depending on the analysis, we're getting a somewhat different picture. But it seems as if there is some equity effects, but exactly whether or not it's negative effects on the advantaged segment of the population or positive effects on the lower income, at least. But it's hard to make a case on, I mean, given the strong average effects that are quite robust, and of course, the whole debate over school finance reform is we have to make it more equitable. And nobody really pays any attention to whether or not we're getting higher quality education. And the conclusion that you might reach from this analysis is that the focus on equity without looking at efficiency might be leading to a set of policies that are suboptimal.
So I think you mentioned it briefly, but can you, so the LRS study, they do find effects on outcomes as well, or do they only look at it? Because I think they find that spending increases, but so basically is the conclusion that what we would need to do is to have a match of possible increased funds from other sources by local revenues in order to keep the local share constant if we actually want to see improvements? Is that the conclusion that we get here?
Well, you know, LRS find in their study that the only positive benefits that they see from additional spending that's produced by these school finance reforms is concentrated on the lowest 20% of the distribution. So it's the bottom fifth that they see these benefits. And this is the benefits of all kids living in school districts that are the bottom 20% of the distribution in terms of expenditure levels. So they're not looking at the same population that we're looking at here, which is, you know, who's coming from a family where the parents do not have a college education, who's coming from a family that's eligible for free and reduced lunch. Now, in their discussion at the very end of their paper, they do look at that. They do look at the same population that we're looking at, and they find no effect statewide on low-income people or disadvantaged people. So really, they don't claim to show that there are positive effects of school finance reform on statewide performance of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. All they really claim to show is that in districts where expenditures were very low, that the school finance reform by raising expenditures did show positive benefits for the bottom 20% of the distribution. Now we have a wider eligibility for free and reduced lunch is about 40 to 50% of the population. So it's a broader category than the bottom 20%. Maybe if we could do a fine-tune analysis and get a better measure of the bottom 20% of the distribution, we could see something here. But there's not a big contradiction between what we get and what they get.
That's super interesting. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so I want to give an opportunity if anybody would like to ask a question in the chat or by raising your hand.
Andrew.
Well, I enjoyed your paper, very, very interesting. And just have one observation, which is that when we have school funding reforms, we increase the state share, but school funding reforms vary tremendously across states. And what matters a lot, and this is particularly true for the equity results, are the nature of the school funding formulas, and to what extent is extra funding, or one way to say it, do states use cost-adjusted foundation formulas which give more money to districts with lots of poor or otherwise high-need students? And I think that's probably beyond your analysis that you can do, but it might, as you can't control exactly for the details of school funding reforms, it does make it harder to interpret what's going on.
Possibly, that's an interesting point. Now, in these 11 states, you're right, they had different kinds of reforms. And the only thing we're looking at is how in each district, we're looking at how it changes in each district, the local revenue share. So this is not just what's happening statewide. This is looking at each district. What is the change in local revenue share? And then we control for state expenditures and for all these other background characteristics. And then we say, relative to the other states in the country, what happens in terms of student achievement? So the kind of policy, the way they get to this probably affects which districts are being impacted and how much they're being impacted. And we don't really know how they got to this. All we know is that's what happened. That's what happened in each district. But we do know what happens in each district.
Which may be another thing that might be going on, is that reforms can also include restrictions or easing of restrictions on local ability to raise property taxes. And as we're talking about shares, and responses to more state aid can be affected by these sort of differential limitations across states.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Very hard to get at.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That if you're going to try to guarantee equity by saying to a state, to a district, and you can't raise your property tax, then you're going to have maybe a different impact, because it's sending a signal, that education is not important. And so if you're sending signals from the state government that education is not important, this could have an adverse effect on the children who come from more advantaged families, perhaps. I mean, that's a possible channel.
Thanks.
There's a question from Ira.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at that list of states. I was living in New York when they made this change, and I left shortly thereafter, and like millions of other people did too. So it's, I don't see like Florida and Texas and Nevada and Arizona are like really high population growth states, or zero, other than New Hampshire, zero income tax. I guess Wyoming has zero income tax, but like the national population growth is happening from people in states like New York moving to places like Texas and Arizona and Nevada, Florida. To the achievement changes you're looking at, am I understanding right? It's different students, right? Like, so if your family picks up and moves to Massachusetts from New York, and the New York schools do better or worse, it's not that necessarily the same student. It's just the students who are in that district when they give the test. And am I?
Yeah,
I don't know
well,
if I'm making sense here, but the exit phenomenon works. It's a powerful dynamic in different ways.
you know, this is an interesting point, Ira. And so, for example, you know, the students, we're talking about 8th graders here. And 8th grade, every year is a different group of kids, right? We're not talking about the same kids at any point here. So we're comparing one 8th grade class with another 8th grade class. Now, generally speaking, you don't get a lot of variation from one year to the next in an 8th grade class. And to the extent that you do nationwide, we're controlling for that in this analysis. So this is differential trends in 8th grade classes. But nonetheless, even though that's true, your point is that in some of these states, you may have had an outward migration of families in response to this event. And it accelerates over time. And this is why you're getting this change. It could be all driven by exiting out. And that could be especially happening among the high SES group. It is a possible explanation. And I don't know if you know, 11 states gives us enough. But you start, you know, because we have to cluster the analysis at the state level here. So, you know, you lose statistical power when you start dividing it up into smaller and smaller numbers. So I'm not sure we could ever check this out. So yes, in New York and, you know, maybe Washington, I don't know about Washington. In Maryland, you're losing population, but you're not losing population in Colorado or Montana or North Dakota or Arkansas. I don't know about Kansas. I doubt that you're losing population. So this is not biased that much against, you don't see a lot of northeastern states on this list here. You see New Hampshire and New York, and maybe Maryland, but so I'm not, you know, the opposite point could be made that you're getting migration in, and you should be seeing the opposite effects in the other states. But no, this is all, your basic point is that these event study analyses, there could be other things going on that could be happening at the same time as the event, or the event could be driving things. So we do, to sort of do another analysis that doesn't have that same problem, we look at districts on the border, and we have some states that have a lot of state funding and other states that have very little state fundings, and they're right next to each other. And so the district's right on the border. And we try to control for any differences between the kids on one side of the border or the other. And we get roughly the same results. And that's all at the same time. So that study has its own problems with it, but it doesn't have this problem with
it. It does look like exit could happen at all different levels in this analysis, but it could be. Is it possible to look at that as an outcome, maybe in a future study? That might also be kind of quite interesting to try and quantify how many millions might have been on the move.
Well, of course, Ira speaks in very exaggerated terms. I don't think we're talking millions. Maybe
I'm aware.
Maybe dozens.
We're coming up on the hour. So I want to thank you all very much for participating and for your comments and contributions. Do keep in mind that we will have the next talk of the PEPG Colloquium Spring Series in 2 weeks' time. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And with all that, I want to thank again our speaker, Paul Peterson, for sharing this study with us, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much.